Good evening, James Worsh. You're over in St. Louis in Missouri. Let's start with the United States and China, a dynamic that you've invested a lot of your own life into as well as your whole career. Let's talk about 1979 when the two countries came together and in so doing merged the talents of hundreds of millions of people. Are we far off from that right now?
I'm afraid we've fallen away from that a fair distance already, and very quickly. I think that's a surprise to many people. There has been probably, as you know, a kind of a sea change in the attitude toward China in Washington, D.C., and among a lot of academics, by the way, that says we thought we understood China, we thought we were all going to enter into the global village and be part of the same kind of international community. And now we're seeing China rise and take on a kind of new, bolder, if not aggressive stance in many ways. So we're in a setting where we have this potentially very dangerous setting of the so-called Thucydides trap. Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, Can China and America Escape the Thucydides Trap, of what happens when you have a rising power and a status quo power. And the history of this for the past 500 years has not been good. So I think what's happening now with a huge amount of pressure because of the economic problems, COVID-19, my understanding of a lot of this, at least from the US, but I think it applies to China as well, we both have domestic political problems. And we need somebody to blame things on. In the United States, we've had a terrible disaster. Over 100,000 people have died of COVID-19. It's a failure in our public health system. There's no way around that. Just numbers tell you that. It's a failure, but our leaders in general, we don't like to admit that this is a failure of our own. Somebody else must be out there. And so this is really tearing apart the relationship even more right now.
Let's try and heal that relationship. Professor Shen Dingli, you're joining us over in Shanghai. Good morning. When we think back again to 79, to people like Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and of course, Deng Xiaoping, and the ideals and the principles that they enshrined at that time by bringing those people together, how much does COVID-19 change that now?
Well, at that time, 41 years ago, China and US came along because they have the common enemy, the Soviet expansionist, which threats America and China and many other places. So for our respective national security and a common interest, China and US come together. But this time, we have probably a more threatening common enemy, the disease. That threats every person, every place in the world. But our two countries, China and the US, are not able to iron out our difference. We have a huge amount of difference on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, and on human rights, etc. But we have made this disease to deeply split the two countries. So China says, why your military spread the disease in Wuhan? And China seems to delude it's a US spreading of the virus. And the US said, how can you produce the disease in your P4 laboratory and possibly intentionally to leak it out, which undercut global villages? And this kind of mutual charging, blaming, at this time have no scientific base. But many people believe when you have this national leader to charge others, they have the national platform making their statement to be known by the nationals. So many people would believe this narrative is trustful, and that deeply undercuts the mutual trust between the countries, which make this kind of irresponsible mutual blaming to have certain market. I think the situation is fundamentally different, and we wasted the best opportunity to heal our relationship by using this, by working together to defeat the common threat.
Well, James, let's go over to you, because 41 years ago, they agreed to disagree. They didn't agree on everything at that time either. There were plenty of gaps of understanding between the United States and China. Yet it took a few people to go into a room and to create a new relationship on the basis that you didn't need to agree on everything. Why has it been so difficult for the two sides to understand here? And it's a mutual thing, that blaming the other, as you've both pointed out, actually worsens the global divisions for everybody.
I'm a big fan of this idea that we can do business with people that we don't agree with everything over. I think that's the key to understanding how we're going to manage these things in the long run. But I think if you look at the history since 1979, the relationship, we started out with some very strong realist, blunt realist negotiators saying we're never going to agree on a lot of stuff, but we can still have a drink and we can settle on some things, but don't expect us to agree. Over time, especially since the time that Shundin Li and I have been working on joint courses and things, but over the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, I think at least in the United States, we came more and more to the opinion, oh, this is going to be like just another community that's like us. And we're going to operate in the global community in a similar way where we understand the same rules, and we're not that different in a lot of ways. And so when we start to see the rise of China as a great global power now, and it asserts itself, I think people were surprised because they've been lulled into this idea that we're so similar. I personally am a believer that it's not very useful to say we're all human beings, and that's true. And in certain cases, it's important to say that, but it doesn't explain very much. And I think instead we should be saying, look, you and I are different. I like you, but you're never going to understand me, and I'm never going to understand some of the things you do. But we can still figure out ways to negotiate certain things and not think that you have to be like me in order to get that done. And I think in this case, these two world powers, certainly in America, we have a notion, the kind of notion of the more perfect union, the city on a hill, that we're the aspiration that every nation is trying to get to. And so we think everybody really wants to be like us. That's a totally naive notion. I learned that in the Soviet Union. That's where I was in the 70s watching this. So that's a silly notion, but it does come back again in American kind of mentality. I think China has this kind of central kingdom idea that we can negotiate things on our own grounds. And so you have two countries that think we could become more like us, except we have two different us's. And I think we need to say, no, there's no reason for that to have to be a prerequisite for us to do our work. And that's, but it's deeply set in both societies.
Well, since I have you both here online, and I know that you have a long academic collaboration and friendship in store as well, perhaps you could give each other one idea on what your countries could do better with the purpose of coming together as they did in 79. So let's start off with you, James. What's one thing that China could do less of, more of, or do for the first time?
Well, I think one thing that just makes a lot of sense here, and as I look at, to the extent I can back off and look at both of our societies, I can understand why China has a perfect right to say, look at our performance of COVID-19, look at your performance. So who's better? Who's doing a better job? Look at how many people we've brought out of poverty. At the same time, America always has this idea, if you're getting to be more secure and powerful, you should be comfortable with the free flow of information. And something that bothers a lot of Americans, they say, why, for example, why are the newspapers controlled so much, and why can we not go where we want to in the press there? So I think openness is something that maybe is not going to happen in China, but I can just say from an American perspective, it's something that bothers Americans, that why not more freedom of the press, and why that's such a big problem.
Okay, so that's one idea. Ding Li, what solution would you offer your friends in the States about how we can move things together forward for the entire planet? It's much more than just two countries.
I cannot speak for the entire China. Speaking for myself, I respect America, leader, people, and their belief. which lays a foundation for the contemporary America, has lots of credit, based on which it has made great achievements. America is entitled to its own way of thinking, which we should respect. While we have difference, we may not adopt it fully, but we have to respect. At the same time, I hope my American colleagues, American community, should have a similar view, that China has its own style. China may have many weaknesses. According to American principle and value, America may very much disagree with what China thinks and what China acts. But America should allow China to do what China is entitled to do. As a sovereign country, China may not be perfect, but China is quickly learning. For instance, for this COVID-19 incident, China may have some room to improve for its first few weeks, from later last year to early this January. But everybody noticed from later January of this year till later March, for about 2 months, China quickly managed to defeat the spread of this disease in such a vast country.
I want to ask you here, because James used the words bold and aggressive in his first response. I mean, I'm just wondering, and I'm just putting it out there, if one side is less bold and less aggressive and therefore perceived to be less confrontational, surely the other side will also adjust by default, and that you'll get more of a middling of the ground there. Do you think that bold and aggressive is a fair assessment, and do you think that China could dial that down a little bit?
I hope China can, but it will be very difficult. In fact, China by this time has not been able to tolerate the U.S. imposition of its value upon China. Why you are not so transparent initially? And China, I mentioned it, China should do better. But we are inexperienced with this new virus. We need some time to do research, to spread information, and not to scare the public. And we should shorten that period. But that kind of room to improve should not deny the huge success that the Chinese side has achieved. U.S. only stressed the China's shortcoming, does not credit China for China's achievement, which helps to stop the spread of disease from China to the rest of the world very quickly from later January and early February. So for this, U.S. used very weird, unbalanced kind of view to impose this on China and to gang up the rest of the world to exert pressure on China is viewed by China as unreasonable.
James, let's move forward in this spirit of what we can do and where we can do it. Ding Li talked about the common enemy. I think both of you did. In those days, 41 years ago, it came in the shape and form of the then Soviet Union, a country that you spent time in the 1970s. These days, there are far more common enemies. I mean, let's go wider than just COVID-19. There's climate change, which they work very well on. There's Ebola, which they work very well on together in the response as well. I mean, James, where would you single out if there was one or a combination of nuanced fronts that they could address with co-incentives, what would they be?
Well, I think we're seeing some of the areas right now. And as a matter of fact, in reality, actually, there is a huge amount of collaboration going on. It's under the radar screen. It's not on CNN, between scientists. I mean, there's information, people going back, not so much people, but information going back and forth from Chinese labs to US labs, all over the place. So I think in order to deal with some of these things, because the things we're dealing with in some sense, again, I think have to do with domestic politics. America's moved into a place where it's, for a variety of reasons, less satisfied with itself. There are more people resentful about what they've been left out of and things like that, and they're looking for an enemy. And so it's easy to set up these kind of international conflicts in ways that are not very helpful at all. So I think the place where we could collaborate, though, is already happening in COVID-19. The U.S., I must say, at least in international diplomatic efforts, has not been as forthcoming as China when it comes to global climate change. I mean, look at Paris. And so, but we have this mood in America that somehow the people here have been left behind and they're angry about things, and not so much as an entire country. They just think about, I, as a lower middle class person, I don't see how my children are going to get ahead. Now, so this is something that then has this spin-off into these kind of conflicts that are emerging. I think hopefully with a new presidential team, we will go back to talking about the thing that's near and dear to Shunding Li's expertise, namely nuclear proliferation and nuclear arms reduction. Right now, we're not doing that. We're moving, if anything, in the opposite direction. But I think the hope here is not so much in the daily news coming out of the White House, because right now we have a president who wants to be in the news every day just to see himself in the news. It has to do with the mid-level and the people-to-people connections that are still very much in place. They're including in the military, for example, U.S.-China military. There's more communication there than there is between the White House and I think in Beijing some days. So we have these things in place. Shunding Li and I have been for years trying to say we need a whole generation of students who know each other as young people. And again, I'd come back to this, not that they would all agree on things, not that they would even like each other, but they would say, this is somebody who's really interesting from a society that I need to understand and collaborate with. And because I understand you, I can trust you enough that I can tell you an honest opinion, you tell me one. And so we're trying to build for the future.
Can they actually do that now? I mean, I ask you both. You're friends, so that friendship's going to pervade any kind of barrier. But in your community, in the academic community, are you able to work now as freely as, say, the scientists are collaborating? And more importantly, the generations of students that you've been nurturing over decades, are they able to exchange in the same way? We have visa restrictions, we have ideological differences.
Well, I'm fairly optimistic about it.
Jim.
No, we have a lot of students right here, right now from China, for example. I meet with them. We sit in classes and they can say, I have to explain to them, I say, you're going to hear some things from my American students that are going to surprise you and you won't like. But they're very diplomatic. They sit there and they listen and they come back with very objective, nuanced responses. And everybody walks out of there, they say, I never heard that kind of thing before at all. And so, yes, I remain optimistic on that. I don't think there's real reason to be, yet they cannot travel so much, but it's a face-to-face, in-person thing that creates networks for a lifetime.
As Jim mentioned, China-US can do a lot. And actually, he and I have worked over more than a decade on WashU student, Washington University in St. Louis, and Fudan University student reciprocal visit and exchange. We have seminar, we have workshop, we have the on-site visit. We discuss a critical issue, which may be too heavy for our young student. How to make the world free of the threat of nuclear weapon. How to reduce. We divide our students to let them play the role of China, US, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. How all this country, we are different, but we presume the role of the other country in order to have the cooperative threat reduction. So India may no longer have a need for nuclear weapon because they feel secure. And how the rest of the world should generate an environment for India, Pakistan, North Korea feel secure, and for even Israel, etc. And for one time, we invited the students in India to come to our meeting. were not for COVID-19, American students and Chinese students would go to South Korea this year. So we are expanding our regionalization, globalization, discussing and participation. Economy, we can immediately do. China, US have cut off an agreement on January 15th on economic and trade deal. And China promised to buy more, and we should commit to our agreement, buying the bean and American agricultural products. As we need to buy anyway, why we don't buy from Americans? This is a written agreement we should do, not to be disrupted by this China-US unprecedented ongoing event. So this student exchange, cultural exchange, and scientific exchange, America now is worried China may steal America's sensitive technology. And this is reasonable. But what about exchange in the non-sensitive, social science, humanity, and less sensitive science and technology? Americans' national security should be preserved. And China should not eye on that. But short of this, we should work together. But Americans should make a fair judgment. What constitutes the definition of sensitivity? Don't have the blanket covering national security. So China-US scientific exchange should be totally distanced. So despite a very gloomy political atmosphere, I still think we can do a lot. Like this webinar, American scholar and a Chinese teacher can exchange view and your leadership. That should never be cut.
James, I see you nodding thoughtfully along, but just to provoke you both a little bit, what part of that did you not agree with?
Well, I think Shen-Ning Lee is always an optimist. So he's painting a picture of where we've been successful, I think. And actually, it gives both of us maybe too much credit, but in these kinds of discussions, the students oftentimes are surprised because I can oftentimes be more critical of the United States than he is, and he could be more critical of China than I am. And I think we need to be able to do that. I also continue to think, though, going back to an image you used at the outset here, James, when you talked about a global family. Now, maybe you grew up in a family where everybody loved everybody all the time and never had disputes. I don't think anybody did. Families are places where you are put together, you're going to be together if you like it or not, but you're people that you can have big disputes with. But it's the diversity in the family that is part of the family. And so learning that that's just the nature of international relations is something that's really important. And I think both in China and the US, we have to stop ourselves when we catch ourselves saying something like, well, basically, now you're starting to understand us better, so you could be more like us. So you could be more like us part is not likely to happen. How we can manage our differences without assuming that we could assimilate all to you to us, or you could assimilate all of us to you. That's where the conflict comes in a lot. The hurt feelings, the resentment, the nationalism.
I want to finish with both of your voices here. I would like you to each ask the other either a question or to leave the other with a short comment. So, Ding-Li, why don't you go first?
My question to Jim. 2 years ago, probably 6 years ago, Missouri had a bigger chaos with the incident of Mr. Ferguson's death. The police may have used excessive violence to make him to lose his valued life. That ignited America protest nationwide. My question is that why such a thing is recurring again. And this time in Minnesota, what your professors are doing? Do you have a role to play to make America better, to prevent this from recurring?
Well, if I had a good answer for that, you would have heard of me on the CNN instead of here, because I was just telling many people, it's not just in 2014, 2013, 14, and Ferguson. It's goes back to 1968 when I was in my youth. So we've been doing some of these same things for 50 years, again and again. Brutality toward Black citizens, outburst of rage is the only way to get change going in society. And it does show you something that is fundamentally different about our society than about Chinese society, in the sense that, we could never do what you did in Wuhan. Everybody would just go home and stay home when they got told to do that. We can't do that. And there are advantages and disadvantages to what we have. But what you're seeing here is an ongoing, brutal, painful discussion in America about what is oftentimes called our original sin, slavery and racism. And that's part of America. We have some great successes over the last 50 years, but we're still struggling with this. And you're seeing it. And I don't know how bad it will get this summer. It's very disappointing, very disturbing. On a personal level, it doesn't affect me in the same way, but I was on email today with a colleague, an African-American colleague. Anybody who's Black in America as a parent, if they have a man in their family, a son, one of the biggest fears is that son, no matter what class, what IQ, whatever he is, could run into trouble with the American legal system. So everybody has to have what they call the talk. When you're about 10 or 11 years old, you have to sit your Black son down and say, look, if the police stop you, you do not ever say anything bad. This is racism. That's still just it's a very bad thing in our society that we're still struggling with. And right now, it's a very painful time because people say, we thought we did this. We thought we were over this. We thought we had Ferguson. We thought we had Chicago in 1968. Why are we still doing this? So it's a long way of saying, I don't know. And a lot of us are struggling with this. The good part is that we are talking about this. We are talking across racial lines. But we're also honestly struggling with how can we keep circling back to the same sorry place. And it is a sorry place, to be honest. So.
And your question or your comment in return?
Yeah, I guess partly because we're so attuned to minorities here with these kinds of issues. Shunding Li, there's a lot of talk in America about the way that the very small minorities in China are treated, because they're very small. Han Chinese are somewhere between 92, 95% of the population. Although China's so big, that's always impressed me. You could still have a minority that's bigger than many countries in the world, of course. But is there any feeling that there's something that's not just a matter of security that has to do with the people in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, and the way that they're being treated? Because that gets a lot of play, and partly because we look at that through our own racialized consciousness, that question comes up a lot for us.
As information concerning the Uyghur is limited in this country. And for those we have, that was from the government. So how to have some third-party independent impartial judgment, I don't have. But at the same time, I read the Western report. I don't know how they get access to the local situation. But that much contrast with the Chinese government's media outlet. So I have the deeply contrasted reporting, the Western reporting and the Chinese government reporting. From the Chinese side, things looks okay. We have some education for many local people, for them to get a work skill, to get rid of the radical idea. Therefore, once they were educated, they will become more normal. But for the Western report, this was kind of brainwashing, and this is against their own will. That make me feel puzzled. If the Western report is true, I think we may more balance our handling to both educate them, but also respect their own view. But whatever respect, we have no respect for separatism, for terrorism, for radicalism. We have no respect. So we need to educate them. You are not entitled to violate the Chinese law. We should tell people more openly and more clearly, probably inviting foreign journalists to Xinjiang to let them to visit those schools where we were educating those local people. Therefore, they will have a more first-hand, on-site-based observation. I think when this kind of view are different, we need to be humble to listen. And outside observer also need to be humble that without going to the local place, how can you judge the local situation fairly and objectively? I believe Chinese side and Western media coverage may have the same common purpose, which is to make Chinese to live better in a more respectful and decent way. And they are entitled to be free of terrorism. You may have a different view, but don't use the radical means. African American may have a different view regarding certain police excessive use of violence against Ferguson and against Mr. Floyd. But you are not entitled to use this kind of burning, chaotic, destructive means. That would inevitably lead to more National Guard and military to defend the social order. So this applies to both countries. Use legal way to express your difference, but don't resort to extremism. So this is my view. I hope my government would give me a chance to go to Xinjiang, to go to this school, so I would speak more fairly and objectively.
James, I think since that was an important question with an important response, would you like a further last word on that?
The themes that I hear from Shunding Li, and it's been in our meetings, and I think it's an unusual theme for Chinese intellectuals, but it's an unusual theme for Americans as well, that we need to be humble. We need to entertain the idea that I know what I stand for. You're not going to get me to change completely, but there might be places where actually I have something to learn, and I could maybe I don't want to give up my beliefs, but I need to entertain that the world just doesn't look the same to somebody else. And that's the kind of cognitive humility we need. I oftentimes joke with him, we need to import that. We'll send him to the White House and teach Donald Trump how to be humble. And then we'd have a lot better world.
Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier, 1968. And of course, that reminds me of Dr. King, what he stood for, but what he gave his life for.
What you ended with about Martin Luther King, I heard an anecdote today. A woman who came here from China, Tsinghua degree, she got her PhD in anthropology in my department, but she has a son now, Felix. And today he asked her, after he watches the television and listens to all this violence, and he's a Chinese American kid, he speaks Chinese, but he's going to American school and everything. But he said, didn't people in America learn anything after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated? That's a perfectly reasonable question, but as a Chinese person looking through American eyes at something that's, because it's naive, it's the best question we could have maybe, and we're not providing the right answer yet.
A few years ago, I brought my daughter to Wushu, and on Wushu territory, I let my daughter Elaine to read I Have a Dream. I also asked her to translate this from English to Chinese. Despite the fact that the dream has not come true to its full extent, I think it's inspiration for all of us should long live in our heart.
Yeah.
So we live in an imperfect world, but we have our genuine intent to make the world incrementally more perfect.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful morning.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.